The silver ladle trembled in Lila's hand as she stirred the massive cast-iron pot, the steam rising like ghosts from the bubbling gumbo. Around her, the kitchen staff rushed in a frenzy of preparation for the grandest wedding the Delacroix estate had ever seen. But Lila's focus remained fixed on the small cloth bundle hidden in her apron pocket. Inside were the crushed hemlock roots she had spent 3 months collecting from the darkest corners of the bayou, dried and ground into a fine powder that looked no different from the cayenne pepper scattered across the work table. Tonight, Madame Delacroix would finally pay for what she had done, and the entire Creole aristocracy of Louisiana would bear witness to her fall. What Lila didn't know was that her act of vengeance would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of the antebellum South, and that the wooden spoon she would leave behind in the mud would become a symbol whispered about in quarters and cabins for generations to come. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had begun like any other on the Delacroix plantation, with the rooster's crow cutting through the thick humidity that clung to the Louisiana lowlands like a second skin. Lila had risen in the darkness, her small frame unfolding from the thin pallet she shared with 2 other housegirls in the cramped quarters behind the main house. At 23 years old, she had spent the last 18 years of her life in servitude to the Delacroix family. First as a child fetching water and fanning flies, then as a kitchen assistant, and finally as the head cook's right hand. Her skin was the color of polished mahogany, her hands calloused from endless hours of chopping, stirring, and scrubbing, and her eyes held a depth of sorrow that most people twice her age never experienced. The Delacroix estate sprawled across 1,500 acres of prime Louisiana land, with fields of cotton stretching toward the horizon in every direction. The main house was a testament to Creole opulence, a 3-story mansion with white columns that gleamed in the sunlight, and wraparound galleries adorned with intricate ironwork imported from France. Spanish moss draped from the ancient oak trees that lined the long drive, creating shadows that danced across the manicured lawns where peacocks strutted and preened. Inside, crystal chandeliers caught the light from dozens of candles. Oriental rugs covered polished cypress floors, and paintings of Delacroix ancestors stared down from gilded frames with expressions of permanent disapproval. Madame Céleste Delacroix, mistress of the estate and soon-to-be mother of the bride, ruled over this empire with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. She was a woman of 45 who looked 10 years younger, thanks to imported French creams and a lifetime of never having performed a single day of physical labor. Her hair was always perfectly coiffed in the latest style from New Orleans. Her gowns were tailored from the finest fabrics, and her jewelry collection rivaled that of any woman in the state. But beneath the cultured exterior and practiced smile lay a cruelty that ran as deep as the Mississippi River. She had a reputation throughout the parish for being particularly harsh with her servants, and the scars on Lila's back were a permanent reminder of just how harsh Madame Delacroix could be. The wedding was to unite the Delacroix family with the prominent Beaumont family from Baton Rouge. Madame Delacroix's daughter, Isabelle, a delicate beauty of 19 with porcelain skin and golden ringlets, was marrying Philippe Beaumont, the eldest son of a shipping magnate who controlled half the commerce along the Mississippi. It was a match made not in heaven but in the counting houses where fortunes were tallied and social positions calculated. The guest list included 300 of the most influential families in Louisiana, and the preparations had consumed the entire household for the past 6 months. Lila had watched Isabel grow from a spoiled child into an equally spoiled young woman, but she bore the daughter no particular ill will. Isabel was simply a product of her environment, raised to believe that the world existed to serve her whims and that the enslaved people around her were little more than living furniture. No, Lila's hatred was reserved entirely for Madame Delacroix, and that hatred had roots that ran 18 years deep. It had been a sweltering August afternoon when Lila was just 5 years old, small enough to hide behind the kitchen door and watch the adults work. Her mother, Delphine, had been the head cook then, renowned throughout the parish for her gumbo, her jambalaya, and her pecan pralines that melted on the tongue like sweet butter. Delphine had taught her daughter everything she knew, letting little Lila stand on a wooden crate to reach the work table, showing her how to make a proper roux, how to season cast iron, how to tell when the okra was perfectly tender. Those moments in the kitchen with her mother were the only happiness Lila could remember from her childhood. But Madame Delacroix had accused Delphine of stealing a silver spoon that had supposedly gone missing from the dining room. Delphine had protested her innocence, had sworn on her life that she had never touched the silver except to polish it. But Madame Delacroix had not been interested in protestations. She had ordered Delphine whipped in front of the assembled household staff as an example, 30 lashes with a leather strap that cut through fabric and skin alike, delivered by the overseer while Madame Delacroix watched from the gallery above with a glass of lemonade in her hand. Lila had screamed and tried to run to her mother, but strong hands had held her back, had covered her mouth to muffle her cries. She had been forced to watch as her mother's back was turned into raw meat, as Delphine's screams eventually faded to whimpers and then to silence. They had carried Delphine back to the quarters afterward, had laid her face down on a pallet, and tried to treat the wounds with what little medicine they had. But infection had set in despite their efforts. The fever had come, and within a week, Delphine was gone. The silver spoon had turned up 3 days later in Madame Delacroix's own dressing room, fallen behind a chest of drawers. The mistress had never apologized, had never even acknowledged the mistake. She had simply continued on as if Delphine had never existed, had ordered another cook hired from a neighboring plantation, and had relegated little Lila to the status of scullery maid, the lowest position in the household hierarchy. For 18 years, Lila had carried that memory like a stone in her chest, had felt it grow heavier with each passing season. She had learned to hide her feelings behind a mask of servility, had perfected the downcast eyes and soft, "Yes, ma'am," that were expected of her. She had worked her way back up through the kitchen ranks, had eventually become indispensable to old Josephine, the cook who had replaced her mother. And all the while, she had waited for an opportunity, had known that someday the scales would balance. The hemlock had been growing wild in a forgotten corner of the bayou, in a place where the enslaved people sometimes went to fish or trap crawfish on their rare, free afternoons. Lila had recognized it from descriptions her mother had shared, warnings about which plants were dangerous and should never be confused with the edible greens they sometimes foraged to supplement their meager rations. The plant had delicate white flowers that looked innocent enough, but its roots contained a poison that could kill a grown man in a matter of hours. She had been careful in her harvesting, had only taken a little at a time so as not to draw attention to the disturbed earth. She had dried the roots in a hollow tree deep in the swamp, had ground them to powder using a smooth river stone, had kept the resulting poison wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the quarters. And she had waited, had bided her time, had known that the perfect moment would eventually arrive. The wedding provided that moment, with hundreds of guests to feed, with the kitchen in chaos, with everyone's attention focused on 1,000 different details. A single addition to a single pot would go unnoticed, and Madame Delacroix had made Lila's task even easier by insisting that her favorite gumbo be served as part of the wedding supper, a special pot made exactly to her specifications and served to the high table where she would sit with the bride and groom and the most important guests. As dawn broke on the wedding day, the plantation transformed into a hive of frenzied activity. Servants rushed in every direction, carrying loads of linens and flowers and food. The dining room was being set with the Delacroix's finest china, each place setting arranged with mathematical precision. In the gardens, workers erected canvas pavilions to provide shade for the outdoor ceremony, strung paper lanterns from the trees, and arranged hundreds of chairs in neat rows. Musicians arrived from New Orleans to set up in the ballroom where dancing would continue late into the night. Lila moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, her mind clear and focused on the task ahead. She helped Josephine prepare the regular gumbo for the general guests, a massive batch that would fill 12 serving tureens. But when it came time to prepare Madame Delacroix's special pot, the one that would serve the high table exclusively, Lila had volunteered for the task. Josephine, overwhelmed with the sheer volume of cooking required, had been grateful for the help and had not questioned why Lila suddenly wanted to take on this particular responsibility. The special gumbo required the finest ingredients, the recipe precisely calibrated to Madame Delacroix's exacting tastes. Lila started with a dark roux, cooking flour and butter together until it reached the color of old copper pennies, stirring constantly so it would not burn. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and nutty, a scent that would have made Lila's mother smile with approval. She added the holy trinity of onions, celery, and bell peppers, let them soften in the roux, then began building the layers of flavor that would make this gumbo special. Fresh shrimp from the Gulf, andouille sausage made by a Creole butcher in New Orleans, tender chicken that had been roasted until the meat fell from the bone. She added tomatoes and okra, bay leaves and thyme, a careful measure of filet powder for thickening, and a complex blend of spices that she had memorized from watching her mother work. The pot bubbled and steamed, filling the kitchen with an aroma that made everyone's mouth water, that had servants sneaking tastes when they thought no one was looking. It was in the final moments of preparation, when the gumbo had simmered for hours and was nearly ready to be served, that Lila reached into her apron pocket and retrieved the small cloth bundle. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears, but her hands remained steady. Around her, the kitchen staff was consumed with their own tasks, nobody paying attention to what she was doing. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing the fine gray-green powder inside, and with a motion so quick it was almost invisible, she stirred it into the pot. The hemlock dissolved instantly, leaving no trace, its bitter taste masked by the complex spices and the rich stock. Lila stirred the pot 3 more times, making sure the poison was evenly distributed, then ladled the gumbo into the special tureen that would be carried to the high table. She placed the silver lid on top, stepped back, and felt a strange calm settle over her. It was done. After 18 years of waiting, of swallowing her rage and her grief, justice was finally at hand. The wedding ceremony took place in the late afternoon, with golden sunlight slanting through the oak trees and painting everything with a warm glow. Isabel looked radiant in her white silk gown, a creation that had required 3 seamstresses working for 4 months straight. The veil was imported French lace that had belonged to Madame Delacroix's grandmother, and the train stretched 20 feet behind the bride as she walked down the makeshift aisle. Philippe Beaumont waited at the altar, handsome in his tailored suit, his expression one of satisfied smugness rather than love. Madame Delacroix watched from her seat in the front row, resplendent in a gown of deep purple silk that must have cost more than most people earned in a year. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, and her face bore an expression of triumph. This marriage would cement her position in Louisiana society, would ensure that the Delacroix name remained among the elite for another generation. She had orchestrated every detail with the precision of a military campaign, and now she basked in the fruits of her labor. Lila watched from her position behind the serving table, one of dozens of enslaved workers stationed around the periphery to ensure that every guest's need was met instantly. She studied Madame Delacroix's profile, memorizing every line, knowing that in a few short hours, that face would be contorted in agony. The thought should have filled her with savage satisfaction, but instead she felt only a hollow emptiness, as if the 18 years of hatred had burned out everything inside her and left only ash. The ceremony concluded with the traditional kiss, and the guests erupted into polite applause. The newlyweds led a procession back toward the main house, where tables had been set in the grand dining room and spilling out onto the galleries. The evening air was thick with humidity and the scent of magnolia blossoms, and as the sun began to set, the paper lanterns were lit, creating pools of golden light that flickered in the growing darkness. The wedding supper was a feast designed to impress, a demonstration of the Delacroix wealth and sophistication. The tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and fresh seafood, delicate pastries and rich sauces, wines imported from France and champagne that sparkled in crystal flutes. Servants moved between the tables with practiced grace, ensuring that no glass remained empty and no plate unfilled. The conversation grew louder as the wine flowed, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clink of silverware against china. At the high table, Madame Delacroix held court like a queen, accepting congratulations and compliments with a gracious nod. Isabel and Philippe sat beside her, the bride picking at her food with the delicate appetite expected of a lady, the groom already showing signs of having drunk more champagne than was wise. The other seats at the high table were occupied by the most prominent guests, including Philippe's parents, the mayor of New Orleans, and a judge from Baton Rouge who owned a plantation even larger than the Delacroix estate. When the main courses had been cleared away and the guests had loosened their collars and fanned themselves against the heat, it was time for the special gumbo. This was a tradition at Delacroix celebrations, a signature dish that Madame Delacroix insisted upon serving to her most honored guests. Lila watched from across the room as 2 servants carried the ornate tureen to the high table, as the lid was lifted to release a cloud of fragrant steam that made everyone at the table lean forward with anticipation. Madame Delacroix's eyes lit up with pleasure as the first ladle of gumbo was poured into her bowl. She inhaled deeply, savoring the aroma, then took up her spoon with an expression of anticipation. Around her, the other guests at the high table were being served, each receiving a generous portion of the rich, dark stew. They waited politely for Madame Delacroix to take the first bite, as etiquette demanded. Lila's heart hammered in her chest as she watched the mistress raise the spoon to her lips. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity. The sounds of the celebration faded to a distant hum, and Lila's entire world narrowed to that single moment, that single action. Madame Delacroix took the spoon into her mouth, closed her lips around it, and swallowed. For several seconds, nothing happened. Madame Delacroix took another spoonful, then another, her expression one of pure contentment. Around her, the other guests began eating as well, making appreciative sounds and complimenting the flavor. Lila felt a moment of panic, wondering if she had made a mistake, if the hemlock had somehow failed to work, or if she had not added enough. But then she remembered what her mother had told her about plant poisons, how they often took time to work their way through the body, how the symptoms would start subtly before building to a crescendo. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her face blank, to simply wait and watch. 15 minutes passed. Madame Delacroix had finished her first bowl and was accepting a second serving, clearly pleased with the gumbo. She was in the middle of a story about her recent trip to New Orleans, gesturing with her spoon for emphasis, when she paused mid-sentence. Her hand went to her throat, and a look of confusion crossed her face. "Are you quite well, maman?" Isabelle asked, leaning toward her mother with concern. "Yes, of course," Madame Delacroix replied, but her voice sounded strained. "Just a moment of indigestion, I'm sure. The richness of the meal, you understand." She reached for her wine glass and took a long drink. But instead of relief, her discomfort seemed to increase. Her face had taken on a pale, almost grayish cast, and a thin sheen of perspiration appeared on her forehead despite the evening breeze. She set down the wine glass with a hand that trembled slightly. "Celeste, you don't look well at all," said Madame Beaumont, Philippe's mother, her own spoon, pausing halfway to her mouth. "Perhaps you should step inside where it's cooler." But Madame Delacroix shook her head, clearly determined not to let anything spoil her daughter's wedding celebration. "I'm perfectly fine," she insisted, though her breathing had become noticeably labored. "Please, everyone, continue eating. Don't let my silly discomfort interrupt this wonderful evening." Yet even as she spoke, her condition was deteriorating rapidly. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of old wax. Her pupils had dilated until her eyes looked almost black, and her hands gripped the edge of the table as if she needed it for support. Around her, several of the other high-table guests were beginning to look uncomfortable as well, their faces showing varying degrees of distress. "Mother!" Isabelle cried out, her voice sharp with alarm. She half rose from her seat, reaching toward Madame Delacroix. "Someone, fetch the doctor immediately." But there was no time. Madame Delacroix's mouth opened as if to speak, but instead of words, a terrible retching sound emerged. Her entire body convulsed, and she pitched forward, knocking her bowl of gumbo across the table in a spreading stain. Foam began to bubble from her lips, white and frothy, and her limbs jerked in violent spasms that knocked her chair backward. Chaos erupted across the dining room. Isabelle was screaming, her white wedding gown splattered with her mother's vomit, as she tried to cradle Madame Delacroix's convulsing body. Philippe stumbled backward, his face a mask of horror. The other guests at the high table who had eaten the gumbo were now showing similar symptoms, though none as severe as Madame Delacroix. Judge Arnaud clutched his stomach and vomited onto the fine oriental rug, while Madame Beaumont gasped for air like a fish pulled from water. The guests at the other tables were on their feet, some rushing toward the high table to help, others backing away in terror. Servants ran in all directions, some going for the doctor, others simply fleeing in panic. The musicians stopped playing abruptly, their instruments falling silent mid-note, adding to the surreal horror of the scene. "Poison!" someone shouted, and the word rippled through the crowd like electricity. "They've been poisoned." Madame Delacroix's convulsions were reaching a terrible crescendo. Her back arched until it seemed her spine might snap, and her eyes rolled back in her head, showing only whites. The foam at her mouth had turned pink with blood, and the sounds emerging from her throat were inhuman, more animal than woman. Isabelle clung to her mother, sobbing uncontrollably, her carefully arranged hair falling in disarray around her face. Monsieur Delacroix, Isabelle's father, burst through the crowd of guests, his face ashen. He had been in the smoking room with other gentlemen and had missed the initial outbreak. He demanded, dropping to his knees beside his wife, "Céleste, Céleste, can you hear me?" But Céleste Delacroix was beyond hearing. Her convulsions were growing weaker, her body's strength exhausted by the violent seizures. The foam at her lips was now mostly blood, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. The doctor arrived, his black bag in hand, but one look at the patient told him there was nothing to be done. He had seen hemlock poisoning before, in a case where children had mistaken the plant for wild carrots, and he recognized the symptoms immediately. "She's been poisoned with hemlock," he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. "There's no antidote. All we can do is make her comfortable in her final moments." The words fell on the assembled guests like a death sentence. Several women fainted, their stays too tight for the shock they had received. Men shouted for answers, demanded to know who could have done such a thing. The other victims of the poisoning, having eaten smaller portions, were being tended to by servants and seemed likely to survive, though they would be ill for days. But Madame Delacroix, who had eaten 2 full bowls of the tainted gumbo, was clearly dying. Lila watched from her position near the wall, her face as expressionless as carved wood. She felt none of the satisfaction she had expected, none of the sense of justice served. Instead, she felt only a profound weariness, as if the weight of what she had done was pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had imagined this moment for 18 years, had dreamed of seeing Madame Delacroix suffer as her mother had suffered. But now that it was happening, it felt hollow and meaningless. Madame Delacroix gave one final shuddering gasp, and then went still. Her eyes remained open, staring sightlessly at the paper lanterns swaying in the evening breeze. Isabelle's screams redoubled, and Monsieur Delacroix let out a sound that was half sob, half roar of anguish. The wedding that was supposed to unite 2 powerful families and secure the Delacroix legacy had instead become a scene of death and horror. "Lock down the estate," Monsieur Delacroix commanded, his voice breaking with grief and rage. "No one leaves. The monster who did this is still here, among us, immediately." Overseers and trusted servants moved to secure all the exits, positioning themselves at doors and gates. The guests, already terrified, huddled together in small groups, eyeing each other with suspicion. Who among them could have done such a thing? And why? The obvious answer, the one that occurred to nearly everyone simultaneously, was that one of the enslaved people must be responsible. Poisoning was a weapon of the powerless, a way for those with no other means of resistance to strike back at their oppressors. Monsieur Delacroix turned toward the servants lined up against the walls, his eyes wild with grief and fury. "Someone here murdered my wife," he said, his voice shaking. "Someone who served us, who ate our food and slept under our roof, repaid our kindness with this ultimate betrayal." Lila knew what was coming next. She had always known that this was how it would end, had accepted the consequences of her actions before she ever harvested that first hemlock root. The other servants were already edging away from her, their survival instincts telling them to distance themselves from the kitchen staff who had prepared the food. Old Josephine was weeping, protesting her innocence, swearing on her life that she had never meant any harm. But Lila remained silent and still. She had no intention of protesting, no plans to plead for mercy or claim ignorance. She had done what she set out to do, had balanced the scales as best she could, and now she would face whatever came next with the same quiet determination that had sustained her through 18 years of servitude. The investigation, such as it was, did not take long. They found the empty cloth in Lila's apron pocket, still bearing traces of the gray-green powder. They questioned the other kitchen staff, who reluctantly admitted that Lila had insisted on preparing Madame Delacroix's special gumbo herself, had been unusually focused on that particular task. They searched her quarters and found the hollow beneath the floorboard, though the rest of the hemlock powder had already been scattered in the bayou during one of Lila's trips to dispose of evidence. Monsieur Delacroix stood before Lila, his face contorted with rage and grief. "Why?" he demanded. "What did Celeste ever do to you to deserve this?" For the first time in 18 years, Lila lifted her eyes and looked directly into the face of her master. "She murdered my mother," Lila said quietly, her voice steady and clear. "She had her whipped to death over a spoon that was never stolen. I was 5 years old, and she made me watch." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth and accusation. Around them, the guests stirred uncomfortably. Many of them had heard whispers about Celeste Delacroix's temper, about her harsh treatment of servants, about incidents that had been hushed up or explained away. But no one had ever dared to speak of such things openly, especially not an enslaved woman to her master. Monsieur Delacroix's hand flew up as if to strike Lila, but he stopped himself mid-swing. Hitting her would be too quick, too easy. Instead, he turned to his overseer, a brutal man named Leblanc, who was known throughout the parish for his cruelty. "Lock her in the smokehouse," he ordered. "Tomorrow we'll see that justice is done. I want every enslaved person on this plantation assembled to witness what happens to those who raise their hand against their betters." 2 men grabbed Lila by the arms and dragged her away from the scene of destruction. She did not resist, did not struggle, or cry out. She walked between them with her head held high, her back straight, looking more like a queen going to her coronation than a condemned woman going to her death. Behind her, the wedding celebration had transformed into something resembling a wake, with Isabel collapsed in grief, and the guests murmuring among themselves about the shocking turn of events. The smokehouse was a small brick building at the edge of the plantation, used for curing meat. It had no windows, and only a single heavy door that could be barred from the outside. They shoved Lila inside, and she heard the thick wooden beam sliding into place, sealing her in darkness. The air inside was thick with the smell of hickory and salt, and the walls still held the warmth of the day's heat. Lila sank to the floor, her back against the rough brick wall. Now, finally, the emotions she had held in check began to surface, but they were not the emotions she expected. She did not feel triumph or satisfaction at having avenged her mother's death. She did not feel fear about what would happen to her tomorrow. Instead, she felt only a deep, bone-deep tiredness, as if she had been carrying a heavy load for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. In the darkness, her mother's face came to her, not as she had looked in those final fevered days, but as she had been before, smiling and strong, her hands moving with practiced grace as she taught her daughter to cook. Delphine had believed in small kindnesses, in making beauty where she could, in teaching Lila that their worth as human beings did not depend on how others treated them. She had never spoken of revenge or violence, had instead preached survival and dignity in the face of oppression. "I'm sorry, Mama," Lila whispered into the darkness. "I know this isn't what you would have wanted." The night passed slowly, each hour marked by the sounds drifting from the main house where the guests were slowly dispersing. Their celebration turned to tragedy. Lila could hear Isabel's wailing, a sound that went on and on until it seemed to become part of the night itself. She could hear the low voices of men discussing what should be done, what example needed to be made. She could hear the frightened whispers of the other enslaved people as they were sent back to their quarters under guard. As dawn approached, Lila rose to her feet. Her body ached from sitting on the hard floor all night, but she ignored the discomfort. She could hear activity outside, the sounds of preparation, and she knew that her time had come. Whatever fate Monsieur Delacroix had decided upon, she would face it without flinching. But Lila had one advantage that no one suspected. She had spent 18 years observing, learning, memorizing every detail of the plantation and its surroundings. She knew which floorboards creaked and which were silent, which doors were kept locked and which had faulty latches, which paths through the swamp were solid and which would suck a person down into the mud. And she knew, from years of listening to the overseers complain, that the smokehouse door had a weakness. The brick that held the door's hinge bar was loose, had been loose for months, but the repair kept being put off because there were always more pressing concerns on a plantation this size. Lila had noticed it weeks ago when she had come to fetch a ham for Sunday dinner, had filed the information away without knowing if it would ever be useful. In the pre-dawn darkness, she ran her hands along the wall beside the door until she found the loose brick. She worked it back and forth, ignoring the pain as her fingernails tore and her knuckles scraped against rough mortar. The brick was heavy, but gradually it began to shift, to move in its setting. She pulled harder, desperation lending her strength, and finally the brick came free with a shower of mortar dust. With the brick removed, she could reach through the gap to the wooden bar on the other side. It was awkward and painful, her shoulders straining in the narrow opening, but she managed to get her hand around the bar and lift it from its brackets. The door swung open, and Lila stumbled out into the cool morning air, breathing deeply of the freedom it represented. She knew she had only minutes before someone checked on her, before the alarm was raised. The entire plantation would be mobilized to hunt her down, and the punishment for attempted escape would be even worse than what she already faced. But Lila had made her choice, had decided in those dark hours of the night that she would not give them the satisfaction of a public execution, would not serve as an example to frighten the other enslaved people into submission. She ran toward the bayou, her bare feet silent on the dew-wet grass. Behind her, the plantation was beginning to stir, the first slaves emerging from their quarters to begin the day's work. She heard a shout, the alarm raised, but she did not look back. The edge of the swamp was 50 yards away, then 30, then 10. The bayou embraced her like an old friend, the dark water closing over her feet as she plunged into its depths. She knew these waterways, had fished and trapped here since she was a child, knew which channels led deeper into the swamp and which were dead ends. She moved quickly through water that came up to her knees, then her waist, pushing aside hanging vines and stepping over submerged roots with practiced ease. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. Dogs barked in the distance, their baying carrying across the water. Men's voices shouted instructions, calling to each other as they organized the hunt. But Lila had a head start, and she had knowledge of the terrain that none of her pursuers could match. She moved deeper into the swamp, into places where the water ran dark with tannin and the trees grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated. Alligators watched her passage with ancient, uncaring eyes. Water moccasins slithered away from her splashing footsteps. The air was thick with mosquitoes and the smell of decay, of things growing and dying in the endless cycle of the wetlands. For hours she pushed on, her legs burning with exhaustion, her lungs aching from the humid air. The sounds of pursuit had faded behind her, but she knew they would not give up easily. They would bring more dogs, more men, would search until they found her, or until the bayou claimed her. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive, turning the swamp into a steam bath that left her clothes plastered to her skin and her vision swimming. She knew she needed to rest, needed water that was safe to drink, but she could not stop. Not yet. Behind every tree might be a hunter. Every sound might be the dogs closing in. It was late afternoon when Lila emerged from the deepest part of the swamp into a small clearing she had not known existed. In the center of the clearing stood the ruins of an old cabin. Its walls collapsed, and its roof long since rotted away. But among the ruins, a small spring bubbled up from the ground, clear water that tasted sweet and clean. Lila knelt beside the spring and drank deeply. Feeling the cool water revive her, she splashed her face, washing away the mud and sweat. And for the first time since she had poisoned the gumbo, she felt something approaching peace. She had done what she needed to do, had escaped when escape seemed impossible, and now she would rest for a moment before continuing on. She knew she could not stay in Louisiana, that every plantation for 100 miles would soon be on alert for a young black woman traveling alone. She would need to head north, would need to follow the stars, and hope that she could find her way to territory where slavery's grip was weaker. It would be dangerous, perhaps impossible, but she had already done the impossible by walking out of that smokehouse. As she rested beside the spring, Lila noticed a wooden spoon lying among the ruins of the cabin. It was old, hand-carved from cypress wood, the kind of spoon her mother might have used. On impulse, she picked it up, feeling its weight in her hand. It seemed fitting somehow, a symbol of the craft her mother had taught her, of the love that had been cut short by cruelty and indifference. As the sun began to set, Lila heard the dogs again, closer now, their baying taking on the excited pitch that meant they had found a scent. She rose to her feet, the wooden spoon still in her hand, and looked around the clearing. There was no obvious escape route, no path that would not leave tracks for the dogs to follow. But at the edge of the clearing, the ground turned soft and marshy, the kind of mud that could swallow a person whole if they did not know how to read the subtle signs of solid footing. Lila had grown up learning to navigate such terrain, had spent countless hours in the swamp learning which patches were safe and which were deadly. She walked to the edge of the marsh and paused, looking back at the ruins of the cabin, at the spring that had given her a moment of rest. Then, with a motion that was almost ceremonial, she thrust the wooden spoon deep into the mud, leaving it standing upright like a marker. The dogs burst into the clearing moments after Lila disappeared into the marsh. The hunters followed, sweating and cursing in the fading light. They found the spring, found evidence that someone had rested there recently, found the wooden spoon standing in the mud like a grave marker. But of Lila herself, there was no trace. They searched for days, combing through the bayou with dogs and boats, questioning every enslaved person on every plantation, posting rewards and making threats. But the swamp kept its secrets, and Lila was never found. Some said she had drowned in the marsh, pulled down by the sucking mud or taken by an alligator. Others whispered that she had made it north, that she was living free somewhere beyond Louisiana's borders, that she had found her way to communities of free black people who would protect her. The wooden spoon became something of a legend among the enslaved people of the parish. They said it marked the spot where Lila had vanished, where she had walked into the bayou and disappeared like smoke. They said it was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most powerless could strike back against their oppressors. Mothers told their children about Lila of Louisiana, the girl who had avenged her mother and escaped justice, and the wooden spoon standing in the mud became a pilgrimage site for those brave enough to venture into the swamp. On the Delacroix plantation, life eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, though it was a normalcy forever changed by that terrible wedding night. Isabel's marriage to Philippe Beaumont proceeded, though the celebration was postponed for a year of mourning. Monsieur Delacroix grew old before his time, haunted by questions he could never answer and guilt over sins he had never acknowledged. The special gumbo was never served again, and the recipe was lost, buried with the woman who had died from it. But in the quarters, in the hidden spaces where the enslaved people gathered away from watchful eyes, they remembered Delphine, who had died for a crime she did not commit. They remembered Lila, who had taken justice into her own hands and paid for it with everything she had. And they remembered the wooden spoon in the mud, standing as a testament to the fact that sometimes, in a world built on violence and oppression, the only resistance possible was one final, desperate act of defiance. Years later, long after the war had come and gone, long after the Delacroix plantation had been broken up and sold off piece by piece, people still spoke of Lila in hushed tones. Some said they had seen her, living quietly in a small cabin far to the north, her hair gone white, but her eyes still fierce and proud. Others said her spirit haunted the bayou, protecting those who fled from bondage and guiding them to safety through the treacherous waters. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere between legend and fact. What mattered was not whether Lila had survived or perished, but what her story represented. In a world where black women were treated as less than human, where their lives and deaths meant nothing to those who held power over them, Lila had made herself matter. She had refused to accept injustice silently, had refused to let her mother's murder go unavenged, and in doing so, had created a ripple that spread far beyond one plantation, one parish, one state. The wooden spoon stood in that mud for decades, weathering storms and floods, until finally the bayou reclaimed it completely. But by then, it had served its purpose, had become more than just a piece of carved wood. It had become a symbol, a story, a reminder that resistance was possible even in the darkest of times, and that sometimes the smallest, most powerless person could shake the foundations of the world. Lila of Louisiana, the slave girl who fed her mistress Hemlock in the wedding supper stew, became a ghost story and a hero story in equal measure. Her name whispered in kitchens and quarters throughout the South. Whether she lived to see freedom or died in the bayou's embrace, she had already achieved a kind of immortality, her deed echoing through the years as a testament to the indomitable human spirit and the terrible price of oppression.